So let me start with a sentence, not a number this time, because this one is stranger than any statistic. The current supreme leader of Iran has never used his own voice in public. Not once, not in a speech, not in an interview, not in a single leaked phone call. Every single word attributed to him since the day he took power has arrived. The same way, typed out, printed, and read aloud by someone else, in a country that just buried its previous leader in front of millions of people. The man who's supposedly replacing him has become something closer to a rumor with a title, and the deeper you dig into who's actually writing his words, the stranger this story gets. Let's get into it. Quick recap for anyone just catching up. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike on Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Within days, Iran's Assembly of Experts named his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as successor. Mojtaba had also been in the compound when the strikes hit and was seriously wounded. That much almost everyone agrees on. What happens after that point depends entirely on which report you're reading, because for 4 straight months, nobody outside a tiny circle in Tehran has actually laid eyes on the man running the country. Clue number 1. Start with the images. Iranian state media has continued putting out pictures and videos of Mojtaba Khamenei delivering messages to the nation. Here's the problem. Multiple outlets covering this story have reported that some of that footage is AI generated, including fabricated portraits designed to make him look healthier and more composed than whatever his actual condition is. Think about what that means. This isn't a government simply keeping its leader out of the spotlight for security reasons. This is a government manufacturing footage of a man nobody can confirm has ever sat in front of a camera since February. If Mojtaba were simply recovering quietly in a hospital, there would be no need to generate fake images of him at all. You only need synthetic footage of someone when the real footage doesn't exist, or when the real footage would raise more questions than it answers. Clue number 2. Now look at who's actually writing his words, because this is the detail almost nobody outside specialist Middle East outlets picked up on. Analysts who examined the written statements attributed to Mojtaba noticed something odd about the prose itself. It was styled to sound like his father's seminary background, but it didn't read like the work of a single author. Some analysts concluded the statements were likely drafted by as many as 3 different people, including a cleric close to the leader's office, Iran's newly appointed IRGC commander, and the commander of the Islamic Republic's War Operations Room. Others have suggested that Ali Larijani, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, decides the general content and simply hands it off to be written in Mojtaba's voice. Whichever version is true, the conclusion is the same either way. The words coming out of the Supreme Leader's office are not necessarily coming from the Supreme Leader. They're coming from a small committee of the exact men who benefit most from being able to speak through him. Clue number 3. And here's where the story stops being about health and starts being about power directly. Because in early June, Iran's own opposition-aligned outlet Iran International published a claim that should have been a bigger headline than it was. According to that report, President Masoud Pezeshkian had grown so frustrated with being cut out of major decisions that he sent a letter to the Supreme Leader's office essentially demanding Mojtaba's resignation. The reported reasoning was direct. The president and his government had been effectively excluded from vital decision-making, and the vacuum created by that exclusion had let hardline factions inside. The IRGC take control of the country's affairs. Read that again. This isn't a foreign analyst speculating from the outside. This is, according to the reporting, Iran's own elected president formally objecting, through official channels, to being shut out of his own government by the very guard corps that's supposed to answer to the Supreme Leader. If that report is accurate, the power struggle in Iran right now isn't a rumor. It's already being fought on paper, inside the regime's own filing cabinets. Clue number 4. So is he even alive? Here's where the American side of this story gets genuinely confusing. President Trump said at one point that the US wasn't sure whether Mojtaba was dead, before later saying he was alive in some form. Secretary of State Marco Rubio later made a more specific claim, saying US intelligence believes Mojtaba is alive and increasingly engaging with matters of state. CNN separately reported that US intelligence assesses Mojtaba is genuinely playing a role in shaping Iran's war strategy, communicating not through electronics but through couriers and in-person visits only, which is itself a security posture, not a health one. Iran's own protocol chief said in one statement that Mojtaba is healing from relatively minor injuries, a foot problem, a lower back issue, some shrapnel behind the ear, a version that contradicts other reporting suggesting he lost a leg entirely and suffered severe facial burns. You now have the Iranian government, the American government, and Iranian opposition media all telling 3 different versions of the same man's condition, and not one of them agrees with the others on the basic facts. Clue number 5. Here's the analysis that ties all of this together, and it comes from someone who studies this exact question for a living. Ali Viez, who directs the Iran project at the International Crisis Group, has said publicly that Mojtaba likely isn't in a state where he can make critical decisions or manage the details of negotiations himself, but that the system is using him to get final approval on the big picture items, not the tactics. In his own words, attributing views to Mojtaba gives Iran's actual negotiators political cover, a way to make unpopular concessions without taking personal blame for them, because they can always say the decision came from the top. That's a genuinely clever piece of statecraft if it's true. Keep a wounded, invisible figurehead technically in charge. Let him absorb the criticism for whatever the country ends up agreeing to, while the actual negotiating gets handled by people who never have to put their own names on the outcome. Now here's what all 5 of these clues add up to when you put them side by side. A leader who's never spoken in his own voice. State media manufacturing fake footage of him. Written statements likely drafted by a committee of the men who benefit from speaking through him. A sitting president reportedly frustrated enough to demand his resignation through official channels, and an American intelligence community that can confirm he's probably alive but can't confirm what he's actually deciding versus what's simply being decided in his name. That's not a country with a functioning chain of command that happens to have an absent figurehead. That's a country where the chain of command itself has become the story. And that brings us to the funeral, because this is where the theory finally met reality in front of millions of people. Iran spent 6 days burying Ali Khamenei across Tehran, Qom, Najaf, Karbala, and Mashhad, with more than 100 countries sending representatives. 3 of Khamenei's other sons stood visibly grieving beside the coffin. Iran's entire visible leadership showed up: the president, the parliament speaker, the IRGC chief, the Quds force commander. Mojtaba did not attend a single day of it, a decision Iranian officials had actually announced in advance rather than trying to hide. One Tehran resident told reporters something that captures this better than any analyst could. She said her country is no longer the Iran where the leader is publicly present, and that while Mojtaba's actual absence from the funeral didn't matter much to her personally, his presence would have been a signal that Iran's old sense of security still existed. Without it, she said, she no longer feels that security at all. That's not a rumor about palace intrigue. That's an ordinary citizen standing at a funeral for the most powerful man in her country's recent history, telling a reporter that the absence of his successor has made her feel less safe in her own home. So here's the real question, and it's not whether Mojtaba Khamenei is alive, because at this point the American government seems fairly confident he is. The real question is whether being alive and being in charge have quietly become 2 separate things in Iran. If a small circle of clerics, IRGC commanders, and Security Council officials can draft his statements, generate his image, and use his name to approve decisions he may not have made himself, then the title of Supreme Leader has become something closer to a signature stamp than a job. And if Iran's own president is reportedly frustrated enough to ask for that stamp's resignation through official channels, then the fight over who actually runs this country isn't coming. It's already happening quietly inside a government that just spent 6 days in 5 cities trying to convince the world otherwise. I don't know how this resolves, and I don't think anyone outside a very small room in Tehran does either. But watch what happens once the funeral crowds go home and the cameras stop rolling, because a regime can maintain a fiction for exactly as long as nobody powerful enough decides to stop playing along the moment that happens. This story stops being about a missing man, and it becomes about whoever finally stops pretending he was ever really in the room. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.